Prof. Anna Matiti, the Executive Dean, Faculty of Science, most important person here this evening, Prof. Gijsbert, Hoogendoorn, the inductee, Prof. Daniel Hammett from the University of Sheffield. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us here this evening. Senior leaders of the university, members of Senate, academics, distinguished guests, students, and of course all of those that have joined us online. Sanibonani, goeienaand, good evening to Bella. It is indeed a great honor and a special privilege for me to welcome you to the Professorial Inauguration of Professor Gijsbert Hoogendoorn. As I do so, I want to express a warm welcome to his loved ones, special guests, and all his colleagues here. This is indeed a full room this evening. It is a proud and a joyful, but also a landmark moment for you, Gijsbert, and for all of us here at UJ, and indeed for the higher education sector in South Africa and beyond. The inauguration of professors is a public ceremony in which newly appointed professors are inducted into office by the Vice-Chancellor or the Vice-Chancellor functionary to deliver their inaugural addresses. This ceremony has its roots in the medieval university, and it indeed serves multiple purposes. First, it is an expression of welcome and an entry for new professors joining the colleagues or the circle of colleagues who are already professors. Secondly, it provides a platform for professors to display their expertise in their respective discipline and of course to showcase their research. In the colonial tradition subscribed to by many universities, assuming the role of professor refers to the gown and the cap, and that is also what we see behind me this evening. Once we've listened to the inaugural address, the gown, which really denotes the professorship, will be formally placed on the shoulders of Gijsbert. Together, and today, we gather to witness Professor Hoogendoorn's entry into this illustrious community of scholars at the University of Johannesburg. It celebrates his contributions to the discipline and ultimately his impact on society. Professors provide a university with its identity, with its character, with its academic legitimacy, and also, very, very importantly, with its integrity. Those are quite heavy words. With its identity, with its character, with its academic legitimacy, and with its integrity. The inaugural lecture is a rite of passage, following the confirmation of the appointment of a person as a professor. This evening, we will listen to Gijsbert as the gown goes to town. And by this, I mean that the power of the inaugural address is when the expertise is showcased beyond the corridors of the university and it reverberates within society. It stands out as a moment of pride for the incumbent, for his family, for fellow scholars at the university, and ultimately also for society. In the past, several philosophers and scholars have defined universities using very narrow conceptualizations. For example, the search for truth, for universal knowledge, and even as instruments to serve the purpose of economy or being utilitarian in nature. Through our work and through our research at UJ, I hope that we can break out of these narrow conceptualizations and reflect on the university as contributing to the public good and working towards societal impact. And this is actually quite important because it aligns very well with our new strategic plan 2035. What then is the role of an intellectual? Edwards said in one of his articles, defines the role of an intellectual as one who commands a vast knowledge of a specific discipline. Gijsbert, that is you. One who is rigorous in the analysis of literature. Gijsbert, that's also you. who views, I see there's lots of people that agree with me, who views being an intellectual as a vocation. Gijsbert, that's you. And who functions as a kind of a public memory to recall what is forgotten or ignored, to make the connections that are otherwise hidden, and to provide alternatives for mistaken policies that you've done on several occasions. It remains then for us as a university with a Pan-African vision to derive our mandate as intellectuals and as professors. And importantly, how do we embrace the role of a professor as a disruptor while continuing to be a flagship carrier for our discipline? And I think that's a very narrow balance. How do we become disruptors or are disruptors whilst continuing to be flagship carriers? This evening we will listen to Professor Gijsbert Hoogendoorn as one further step, just one further step in his journey of being a professor. This is a journey which does not conclude with this lecture, and it didn't start with this lecture. Notwithstanding, the inaugural lecture does create an opportunity for self-reflective pause in the journey of a professor, and I'm very much looking forward to this evening. Let me now introduce the Executive Dean, Prof. Anna Matiti, to introduce Gijsbert to us.
Good evening. Dumelang. Sanibonani. Goeienaand. I'm going to continue until I hear your voices. Vice Chancellor Functionary, Professor Bettin van Vieren, please allow me to observe protocol. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Gijsbert Hoogendoorn. Professor Gijsbert Hoogendoorn was born on 30 June, maybe I shouldn't say that. Should I say the date? In Vryheid, KwaZulu-Natal. He is the youngest of 4 children of Mr. Nico Hoogendoorn, a musician from Utrecht in the Netherlands, and Marie Hoogendoorn, a potter from Kroonstad in the Free State province. He grew up in Bloemfontein. Gijsbert registered for a Bachelor of Arts in 2000, which he completed in 2002. He then pursued to complete a bachelor's in honors in geography in 2003, a master's in geography in 2006, and a PhD in geography in 2011, all at the University of the Free State. In terms of professional experience, Gijsbert was appointed as a researcher at the Center for Development Support at the University of the Free State from 2005 to 2006. In 2007, he was appointed as a junior lecturer in the Department of Geography at the University of the Free State. In 2008, he took up a position as a lecturer in the Department of Geography at Rhodes University in Makhanda in the Eastern Cape province. In 2009, Gijsbert attained his first permanent academic appointment at the School of Geography, Archaeology and Environmental Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. He served first as a senior tutor, then as a lecturer, and subsequently as a senior lecturer. In May 2015, he took up a position as an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environmental Management and Energy Studies at the University of Johannesburg. From the years 2017 to 2020, he served as head of department. In August 2021, Gijsbert was promoted to full professor. In 2024, he was awarded the Gold Medal Award by the Society of South African Geographers for his meritorious contribution to geography in South Africa. I was expecting some clapping there. Gijsbert's research interests fall under tourism geography with a particular focus on second home tourism, climate change, and tourism and urban tourism. He has published over 100 journal articles, book chapters, monographs, and conference proceedings. He has successfully supervised numerous PhD and master's theses to completion. Gijsbert is married to wonderful Fatima Valley. They have 2 psychotic Labradors, Salty and Peanut, wait for it, and an abusive parrot named Luchman. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Hoogendoorn.
Yumna BF. Thank you very much, Kia Leboa, Professor Motiti, Professor van Vieren. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And hello, everybody. Today, what I will be doing is I'll be discussing research that we've done over an accumulation of research over a number of years. Usually at a professorial inauguration, a professor will tell you what they have done during their careers. And that is fine, but my view is that we should rather focus on what should be done. So this will be an attempt to do that rather than reflecting. I'm going to be projecting. So yeah, thank you very much. So this paper is called Whisper in Corridors: International Politics and Practice of Knowledge Production in South African Human Geography. So I'm completely aware that not everybody in the audience are academics and or geographers. So I'm going to try and pitch this at appropriate levels. So what we've experienced over the decades is there's been numerous reflections within debates around the types of geography that we produce, whether it be the politics of knowledge production, the critical or applied approaches to research, the Anglophone dominance, and the critiques we had that especially during Fees Must Fall. But essentially, this paper was a call to arms or a take-up of a call to arms to Shari Daya's work in 2022, where she asked or called for an intervention that reconfigures the discipline as a critical space of care. That's what I would try to do in this presentation today. So geography in South Africa has seen extensive reflection by numerous people in the audience right here, we've reflected on the inequalities, we've reflected on issues of justice, we've reflected on issues of production, and this essentially forms part of this process, but we're trying to sum up what we're doing here. So the purpose is ultimately to critically reflect on how apartheid and post-apartheid politics of knowledge production perpetuate intranational inequalities in South African human geography. Essentially, this praxis of care that I'm speaking of is trying to recognize the extremely unequal national landscape of academic practice, and essentially opening up the difficult conversations that we are required to have around this issue of transformation in the discipline, which, as one of the respondents from the research said, is only whispered or just whispered in corridors. So just a little bit of theory, just a few slides of theory. This research speaks to the multiscalar politics of knowledge production. And we're back. And we essentially reflect on Steinek's work around the pestimicides that have resulted as a result of the cognitive empire that Ndlovu Ngacheni speaks of, and the Euro-American dominance in knowledge production, and how do we reflect on these issues, and how do we go forward. there's essentially a marginalizing, a sidelining, an erasure, and a dismissal of other people and epistemologies that persist in academic disciplines and in geography specifically. Then we also looked at Jazil's work, Tariq Jazil's work, which called on geographers to interrogate cultures of academic knowledge production and how do we ultimately decolonize knowledge. And then further taking some of Jazil's work, Jazil and McFarlane, outlining the way in which we publish, the citations that are garnered, the training, the reviewing, the resource creation, and the conditions that are conducive to knowledge production. So this is just some of the theory. But let's focus on the practical aspects of this paper, the South African higher education context. As many of you know, that we are bogged down by a lot of what has happened during apartheid in terms of our academic systems. Essentially, apartheid, as many of you will know, was an intersection of education and racial capitalism, and it left South African society and the educational sector in a deeply iniquitous state, leading us charged with supporting transformation and restorative justice in the post-apartheid environment. But unfortunately, in 1997, the Department of Education brought out the white paper on education, which ultimately signaled the commodification of academia. So students were rather seen as investors and academic departments as sources of revenue generation. And despite the rhetoric of equality, it was rather a case of entrenching inequality. So, and as I'm sure something that keeps up Professor Mutiti at night and Prof van Vieren, so austerity policies, inequalities in access, dependence on tuition fees, private sector-based revenue, all have exacerbated these challenges. There's also, she's nodding, so so in other words, it's true. There's a growth in student numbers that remains a challenge. So just to make this more practically evident, so in 2022, January 2022, there were about 240,000 places at South African institutions for students, for first-year students. Of which the vast majority of them are at UNISA. But there were close on almost 900,000 students writing their examinations in December 2021. So essentially, if you can get to university, you are in an extremely elite situation, despite the extreme struggles that we deal with on a daily basis with students not having money for food, not having money for accommodation, etc. We also have the situation with NSFAS, the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. We also sit with, Prof Matiti is going to again nod her head, high non-completion rate, student debt, and disproportionate numbers of funded students enrolled at under-resourced, historically disadvantaged institutions. So that's essentially some of the context which we sit with in the South African higher education sector. Now, if we move this then to geography as a department in either humanities faculties across the country or in science faculties, let's just reflect on their position around these issues. So geography in South Africa was linked to the colonial project, influenced by conservative religious ideals, environmental determinisms, and notions of racial superiority. And that was the case very much probably until the late 1970s, when some researchers started to interrogate the inequality of the apartheid systems and the colonial systems. And only since the late 1970s have we had our first research on black communities in geography by Keith Bevan and Chris Rogerson. In the 1980s, geography was mired in structural inequalities, dominated by white scholars and expected to conform to national agendas. And then when we finally reached democracy in 1994, human geography turned to more empirical and policy-orientated questions. And this has led Professor Gijsbert Knight at WITS to say that geography research in South Africa, geography research overall in South Africa remains weak in terms of quantity, quality, and impact. Now, this is on record because this is going for live stream. I don't necessarily agree with this statement entirely, but there are it's a worthy statement to reflect on. Okay, in terms of the methodology that we essentially use two data sets. One is the core community of practice, 150 scholars in total. These are geographers that are at South African Human Geography or South African Geography departments, and then a broader community of practice is 185 scholars that either were trained as geographers and then moved to other departments, say School of Tourism, or a policy-based or sociology, going to different departments, or research fellows, senior research fellows, visiting professors, and so forth. We used the Scopus database as a relevant source for publication data for the period 2010 to 2011. 2010 to 2021. We use Scopus, and just to reflect on that, it is a partial database, but as far as research goes, or publication record goes, is probably the most comprehensive we can find. We also use the VOS viewer to develop visual representations of author citation analysis, and interviewed 20 human geography staff from a range of historically advantaged institutions and historically disadvantaged institutions. So here's the first slide, which really emphasizes what we are dealing with in terms of our publication outputs in human geography in South Africa. You'll see in column number 3 that in total from 2010 to 2021, about 1,401 publications from geographers who are not in geography departments, with only 857 publications coming from geographers who are at geography departments. So this shows quite a stark differentiation between people who are geographers at geography departments and people who are incentivized to do research elsewhere, or who are invited to be research fellows. So it speaks to sort of revenue sources and some of the issues that we deal with. This is the first visual representation. The figure 1 is co-authorship patterns among South African human geographers based at local departments. Here you can see essentially who does the research in the country and who they work with, and you can see there my name is there in maroon, and then my PhD supervisor is just north of me. And numerous other people that may not be knowledgeable to or useful for a lot of you sitting here, but there's a lot of you here who are quite aware of who we are talking about here. So you can see essentially the silos of research, who works with who, and what are the co-authorship patterns. It also speaks to issues of race and gender. The second figure is citation patterns amongst the broader community of practice, mapped by authors and limited to those who have published a minimum of 2 documents and have at least 1 citation. So this changes the figure or the picture a little bit from that to that, and then you can see very much who's in a dominant position in the discipline. And you can see the bigger the circle, the more the publications. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the highest quality publications, but it is certainly a high indicator of productivity. So here you can see, again, very much dominated by is this on my side or? Okay, no problem. So this is very much, again, a lot of the comments I made just now about race and gender comes to the fore here. Okay, then the fifth figure, or the third figure, sustained co-authorship patterns. Now we're looking at quantity, minimum of 5 papers among South African human geographers based in local geography departments. So here you can see the picture changes again in terms of who does research over the last 10 years, who does more research, and then really who does the bulk of the research. And you can see this very much clusters around fewer names doing the majority of the research. And then this figure is co-authorship patterns among the broader community of practice, mapped by author and limited to those who have published a minimum of 2 documents and at least 1 citation. So here is a very useful graph in terms of seeing the citation networks that essentially has been established between researchers. And you can see the lines are quite strong between certain authors. Then we look a bit at the interviews we did. Some people, so one of the interviewees, Rukia, said in her reflection on South African human geography that really, really good human geography departments with lots of interesting research. And these are not their real names, by the way. SIPO said when it comes to knowledge production, there is still a vast difference between the white institutions and the black institutions. So essentially what we're highlighting from the figures that we spoke about, but also some of the quotes coming from the qualitative interviews, that there are a small number of human geographers, no longer based at South African human geography or South African geography departments, that are very productive. And one of the ways in which they've been able to do this is by the mobilization of international networks, by historically advanced institutions to appoint overseas academics, to honorary positions, consolidating reputational capital while boosting publication outputs. And this is disproportionately the case when it comes to the former or the currently historically advanced institutions, particularly at UJ, but also at institutions like the University of the Free State, Rhodes, WITS, and UCT. So one of the themes that came from the interviews and from the data analysis is essentially a self-perpetuating resource inequality. Thandi outlines a self-perpetuating cycle of opportunity and prestige for historically advanced institutions. She says historically black institutions always on the back foot, the playing ground is not leveled. And subsidy systems prioritize quantity at South African institutions, quantity research rather than quality research. And this has led to a dramatic increase in research output. In 2005, South African institutions as a whole produced about 7,230 units. And in 2019, it hit 21,000 units. So Thandi rightfully says, publish, publish, publish. Some may say publish or perish, some may say publish and perish, some may say perish and perish, yes. And because we are at UJ, in 2022, the University of Johannesburg submitted 2,817 units for DOHED subsidy, which provided in the region of about 350 million rand to the institution. This is compared to the University of Venda, which submitted 116 units and got roughly 14 million rand in revenue. So that gives you a sense that the Faculty of Science at University of Johannesburg probably produces, and Professor Mayboom can correct me, but probably in the region of about 5 to 6 times more than a single university. And this really does change the playing field, or does not level the playing field at all. Okay. Adele said South African human geographers they're just comfortable with how they do geography here. It's philosophy and theory dead. It's the painful truth. In other words, it's this hunting of units over the hunting of research that is necessarily impactful. So there's also some of the issues that came up as feelings of marginalization amongst human geographers, especially at historically disadvantaged institutions, especially in comparison to physical geographers and or environmental science, the environmental science dominated departments. Okay. Zulani then also highlighted the crucial concern is the viability and the sustainability of workloads for human geographers at various historically disadvantaged institutions where commonly there are few human geographers. And I think if I had to say the word viability, sustainability of workloads, and I kept on repeating that, you'll have a vast number of people in this audience starting to do do this. Okay. Orbo noted, none of us actually have time to pursue research. We only do that in our spare time. So Riaz said, you don't have the time to do it. You know you've got to make the time, but if you're the only 2 staff members dealing with 180 plus students, it becomes difficult. So so there's essentially very much this feeling of being left behind, which I call here the insidious, everyday haunting of apartheid. Adele said the spectre of colonization and apartheid will still haunt us for as long as we are not dealing with it in the body of human geography. There are also numerous questions that came up around gatekeeping within the discipline. Scholars from historically disadvantaged institutions very much expressed their concerns with the current and future aspects of the subdiscipline. Zama, for example, said, historically advantaged institutions-based staff tend to forget Must I plug it in and plug it out just to see? Okay. Let me do it anyway. I'm out of breath anyway. Let me drink some water. There you go. Okay, Zama explained historically advantaged institutions-based staff tend to forget and not pay attention to what is going on in universities like Fort Hare, Venda or Walter Sisulu. Sipo said, we try our level best to be united and positive, but the discrimination, the marginalization is there even though it is subtle. As a black geographer, you can feel the discrimination. It's only that it is difficult in some cases to pinpoint and say, no, this is not acceptable. And Adele says, we have a long way to go as a multiracial human geography community of practice. And Zama then very accurately says, how do we dismantle what divides us? So essentially, we are sitting with a double-bind periphery in the discipline between those of us who were trained at historically advanced institutions or perhaps overseas, those who have trained at historically disadvantaged institutions, and then the lack of access to resources, but also the internal competition. And I think this is probably the most stark figure that came from the research. This is citation patterns among South African-based human geographers, working with geography departments mapped by author and limited to those who have published a minimum of 2 documents, at least 2 citations. So this very much shows a cluster of sort of the highest levels of production in South African human geography, and those who are essentially connected into the core of the research and those who are not. And there are obviously numerous reasons for this. But certainly the main argument of this paper is this sort of stark polarization within human geography. It is important to have closely connected collaborators with who we can work with and the citation networks we can access. I was lucky enough to end up at institutions like the University of the Witwatersrand and University of Johannesburg, where I met people from overseas institutions and being able to have discussions about collaboration and taking work further. And that's also because you are in metropolitan regions, major urban centers, where you are able to build these connections and take this type of research further. So this is not to suggest, of course, that scholars at historically disadvantaged institutions are incapable of producing research outputs on the same scale. that is certainly not the case, but it rather points to the structural barriers that perpetuate silos of privilege and marginalization. Now, as an academic, it's very easy to criticize. It's very easy to criticize, and it's not always that easy to come up with solutions. So, moving hopefully to the future, there's a couple of things about how we can potentially address some of the issues. South African human geography, like any other discipline, I think, in South Africa faces numerous challenges. But as Daya argues, this is an opportunity to build a praxis that comes from a space of crisis, or build a new praxis that comes from a space of crisis. So while what we've seen in this presentation is that we've got publication figures showing a flourishing discipline, delving beyond that, you can see that there are surface highlights various challenges and questions that need to be answered. So how might these be addressed? There may be a need for generational change. People who are in the system that don't necessarily give an opportunity for colleagues from elsewhere to produce work, or potentially play gatekeeper. That may be one way of doing it. That's what Thandi suggested. Given the significant contributions, in this case the majority of the research in South African human geography comes from people who are not in geography departments, perhaps there should be some kind of system where overseas fellows can be introduced to historically disadvantaged institutions and support to develop networks, and therefore sort of gaining some level of momentum in terms of research output. Donaldson, for example, promoted a greater internationalism in scholarship that should be realized, that promotes intra-national solidarity between historically advanced institutions and historically disadvantaged institutions, seeing how these institutions can work a lot stronger with each other. Other priorities could include stronger mentoring of staff alongside skills-based training, greater support for collaborations and networking amongst HDIs and between HDIs and HAIs. So essentially, we need to have these tricky conversations in South African human geography, but in the South African academia at large, about the efforts to develop a praxis of care within the discipline. And this is not only a question of resources, but it's also intra-departmental socialization and the establishment of these cross-cultural, cross-racial, and cross-disciplinary relationships. So the main argument here is that to create an ethical and sustainable praxis within South African human geography, we need to privilege community over organization, and I don't necessarily think that is the case right at this moment. These are not easy conversations to have, and especially for me to stand here and bring up these issues, it questions my positionality and the politics around my positionality, but there is a responsibility of academics who are in South Africa or connected to South Africa to open up these discussions and talk about it. So greater efforts are needed, but also greater efforts are needed from governments, universities, and individuals to foster inclusion and collaboration. And individual scholars with various forms of privilege have a vital role in promoting inclusiveness, academic citizenship, and responsibility. So that is essentially the end of my academic side of my presentation, and I would just like to take a few minutes to thank a few people. So thanks first of all to everybody. I'm always very hesitant to thank people because there's always going to be someone, hey, why didn't you thank me? See, my niece already pointed. So first of all, I'd like to thank my wife, Fatima Valley. She's there at the back. Must I ask you to stand up? Thank you very much for everything. You've kept me alive in so many ways, in facing ways of doing academia in South Africa. I'm certainly one of the lucky ones. Thanks to my father, Nico Hoogendoorn, my mother also, who can't be here with us, and then to my extended family, and this is everybody. Not just those who are here, also those who are in Bloemfontein and Lady Grey and elsewhere in the country. Also then a heartfelt thanks to my dear friends, Peter and Marius de Wet, who I've known for deep over 30 years now, and my other friend Morne Hubert for some wonderful times. In terms of people who are my friends but are also academics, Gustav Visser. Gustav, you can stand up, thank you. My third year project supervisor, honors supervisor, master supervisor, PhD supervisor, because I was at the University of Free State and I had no money to go anywhere else. And so he found me as a rather, how shall I put it, unfocused third year student and whipped me into shape. So I'm deeply thankful for that. Jennifer Fitchett, who can't be here tonight, for explaining to me the squiggly lines. I am horrible with statistics, and luckily she is not, and we've done a substantial amount of work on tourism and climate change, which has been quite impactful. Dan Hammett, which you will hear more from, University of Sheffield. Thanks very much for making the effort of flying in yesterday, flying out tomorrow night back to Sheffield. Thanks very much for being willing to come here for this and being a discussant. Irma Boyens from Strathclyde University for the research we've been tackling, especially around township tourism, slum tourism. Lochner Marais, one of my PhD supervisors and my boss way back when, who definitely taught me a lot of very vital and useful life skills in terms of surviving the academic trajectory, how to publish and flourish, and how not to take review process personally and not to care essentially, and just keep on keeping on. He's a real machine. Etienne Nell, a true gentleman from Otago University, who very much also mentored me in a major way in terms of how to approach academia, and still, for the most part, be a nice person. Jarkko Saarinen from Oulu University, for coming to say hi at least 4 to 6 times a year, and we have coffee, very, very strong coffee every year, every time we visit, and we talk about geography and where we're going to take it. And then my dear friends in Umeå University in Sweden, Andreas Back, Roger Marjevara, and Dieter Müller. I have visited Sweden numerous times, and they're always very courteous and warm guests, warm hosts rather. And then, all the colleagues at UJ, everybody, the department, the science faculty, those people who served with me during the HOD term, Prof Matiti, Prof Bettine. Thanks very much, everybody. And then the final thanks goes to these two buggers. That's Salty the Psychotic and Peanut. They keep me busy. Okay, thank you very much.
We'll just adjust the microphone for the short person in the room. Thank you. As was mentioned earlier, I'm Dan Hammett. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield. But you're not here to hear about me. You're here to hear my endorsement of Prof Hoogendoorn. So it gives me tremendous pleasure to stand here today to endorse a very good friend and an excellent colleague, Prof Hoogendoorn, his appointment to chair, and to congratulate him not only on an excellent inaugural lecture, I have to say that, I helped with the paper, but also to recognise the years of stellar achievement and academic citizenship that have resulted in his position. I first met Prof Hoogendoorn in 2009 when he joined WITS. He had the misfortune, as a newly appointed senior tutor at WITS, to be assigned office space with myself. I was a postdoctoral research fellow at the time. And from that moment on, a camaraderie was being born that survived the last 15 years of stress and academic work along the way. We've shared many conversations and reflections of differing opinions and shared concerns. Crucially, those conversations have continually revisited conversations about research, about teaching, and the space and nature of human geography in universities, not only in South Africa, but beyond. We've continued these conversations for many years. Perhaps more often we should do. We also bring rugby into the equation, but that's life. And we've supported each other through many, many projects on tourism geographies, political geographies, citizenship studies, climate change, and, as we've heard about today, critical reflections on the academy. His willingness to be a sounding board for ideas, to generously share his time, his knowledge, and creative energies have been hallmarks not only of our collaborations, but I think overall of his career to date. And I think the colleagues sat in the room here, his master's and PhD students who he's seen through completion, would all agree with that. While I have been based overseas, back in the UK, for the last 14 years, I've followed Prof. Hoogendoorn's career very closely. I've seen his research flourish and expand, move beyond his initial focus on second homes, a really important strand of work that continues to this day. If you don't believe me, try going to Cornwall in the UK and seeing the protests there about second homes. It's a global issue, and Gijsbert has been one of the leading figures in talking about those issues. He's moved on from that, though, to talk about and tackle questions around tourism's intersection with economic development, with climate change, with transformation, and social and environmental justice. It's like buzzword soup for a British academic at this point. Having published in the region of 100 peer-reviewed articles, multiple book chapters, and the co-authored book on climate change and tourism in Southern Africa with the internationally renowned press Routledge, his works have come to be amongst the most influential on tourism and climate change in Southern Africa. The breadth of his work is reflected in the diversity of world-leading journals that have published his work, from Tourism Geographies to International Development Planning Review, to the Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, to Weather, Climate and Society, to Area, and obviously also to the South African Geographical Journal. This array of interdisciplinary and cross and subdisciplinary reach and journals illustrates the scope and importance of Prof. Hoogendoorn's research and also his commitment to making critical contributions that make a difference to his fields of study. As the diversity of his topical expertise has broadened, so too has his geographical engagement. He's leading the way amongst Southern African scholars in reversing the typical flow of researchers from the global north coming to the global south. I stand here as an example of that flow, and I can see another one sat behind Gijsbert there. And as we heard in the presentation earlier, those flows have real-life consequences in terms of subsidy income, research policy, practice, and the like. What's really important then with Prof. Hoogendoorn's work is reversing that flow of becoming an internationally renowned scholar on tourism and second homes, not just across the Southern African region, but beyond, into the Indian Ocean, China, and Scandinavia, and really leading the way of South African scholars in making their voices heard at the global stage, of writing back and kind of bringing theory back from the south into the north. My regard for Prof. Hoogendoorn's work is shared by many others. As we've already heard from earlier on from his introduction, in 2024 he received the Society of South African Geographers Gold Medal in recognition of his meritorious and sustained contributions to geography in South Africa. The citation for this award noted Prof. Hoogendoorn's contributions to international theory and debates, his commitment to excellence in teaching and support for students, and leadership within the discipline. The timing of that award, coming soon after the publication of the Whispers in Corridors journal article in the Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, aptly reflects Prof. Hoogendoorn's critical and self-critical engagement with multiple academic debates. In this particular instance, the multifarious and entrenched legacies of apartheid. These specific concerns reflect a wider commitment to and interest in questions of social justice, inequalities, and the global interconnections inherent within these, themes that run throughout his research. Crucially, Prof. Hoogendoorn's research seeks to not only interrogate, but also to critically develop empirically grounded theoretical insights that recognise and prioritise the local context, but which address, and directly and implicitly, address many of the challenges facing South African human geography and human geography the world over. His interest and commitment to delivering high-quality, international-facing research, which has local relevance and impact, as well as contributions to global conceptual debates, is amongst the best in the world. It is with utmost pleasure, then, I commend Professor Gijsbert Hoogendoorn to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wonder, Fatima, whether you would come to the front, and Gijsbert, your father's also here, right? Yes. Please join us, and then Anna also, let's do the robing. Maybe move back a little bit. There you go. This is not an easy thing to put on. So, and the hat. Fatima, do you want to- Daniel, come and sit with your hat, please. Eish, those COVID years, right? I remember sitting on top of the bed, and there were all these WhatsApp coming through, and I think it must have been 11 at night. They said, I think it was a Thursday evening, UJ will close on the Monday, and I was like, what? And I think quite a few people were like that. Colleagues, I've often asked myself, what is a scientist? And I mean, I must admit that, Gijsbert is my colleague, and many of my colleagues are in this room, and my dean is also in this room. What is a scientist? And then, the first thing that comes to mind is it's a crazy person with crazier hair doing weird things that no one understands what they're doing. And the first thing I do is I look in the mirror and I sort of try and, flatten some of my hair. But I think a scientist is a lot more than that. Being a scientist carries a huge responsibility. Not only in terms of knowledge production, certainly in terms of that. Gijsbert did say perish, or what did you say? Something like that, perish, or perish. But also that we need to be critically aware of the biases that there are. And Gijsbert has pointed some of those out, and there's a lot more bias in science. And those, those are things, as he's pointed out, the traditional haves, haves, and not haves. Women, person of color, there are so many biases. And it's really wonderful to see a growing number of papers, and this is one of, the one that you spoke about is one of those papers that actually draws attention and calls out these biases. And I think it's critically important that we take note of that. When we then have that knowledge that there is a bias, I think, the most important thing is, what do we do with it? How do we think about it? How do we, play it over in our minds? And what do we do about it? And I think that is a critical question. And the challenge to all of us here is, now that we know of these biases, every week in Nature Science, all those really high-flying journals, there's a paper that speaks about some of this bias. What do we do with it? Do we critically reflect on who do we publish with? Do we critically think who our collaborators are? And I think that is a challenge to every person in this room who has published, who will publish, and who's thinking about publishing. When you think about your projects, just take a moment or two to actually just pause and not just think about the project, but think about the inclusivity of the people on that project and what can you do to work against these biases. And that really is a challenge for all of us. The University of Johannesburg, we receive more than 600,000 choices. Remember, each applicant can submit 2 choices. More than 600,000 choices for 10,500 first intake spaces. What do we do to change that? How do we do, because that in itself is also a bias. Colleagues, on that note, a little bit of time for introspection in terms of how we move this forward. Gijsbert, I'm hoping everybody's going to download your paper and read it. And I was going to say cite it. But let's consider that and let's just see how we actually work, take this forward and as a collective work against these biases. And on that note, thank you very much again, Daniel, for coming so far. It's wonderful to have you here. Gijsbert, to you and your family, congratulations again. I've certainly learned a lot from you. I've enjoyed all my interactions with you, and I'm inspired by you very often. Colleagues, there's some refreshments outside. They are, for those of you that don't know, from our School of Tourism and Hospitality. They are actually our students. Also, a lot of these. So when you enjoy the refreshments, it's part of our university training. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening further.